The 1980s was an amazing time to grow up. The changes taking place in just about every aspect of life could be felt by everyone. Technology was the biggest driver of this, and life seemed like it couldn't get any better. The 1980s were a good mix of a latchkey past and the digital future that was to come. But things today are far different from what we ever imagined. So let's take a look at 13 things from the 1980s that kids today would never fully understand. The use of technology in schools varies greatly when we think back to the 1980s. They of course had overhead projectors, which allowed the teacher to project transparent sheets onto a screen, which allowed them to work through problems or worksheets as a whole class, essentially replacing the need for a blackboard. But when we think of classroom technology today, kids have iPads and laptops that they carry around with them all the time. Back in the 1980s, you were lucky if there was one giant computer somewhere in the classroom, or a special computer room you would go to that was used by the whole school. The days you could play on the computer was always a treat because it meant you could play the Oregon Trail. For some, this was the first memory of using a computer, and it certainly was memorable, especially since you were usually killed off before you made it to Oregon. Kids today have access to more entertainment than they could ever dream of consuming. When new movies come out, you can stream them instantly, and you don't even have to beg your parents. In the 1980s, the closest thing to on-demand was waiting all week to head to the video store. This was after you waited months for the movie to be released on VHS. Then when you would head over to the new release section at your local video store, there's a good chance all the copies were already rented, and you had to wait even longer. There was still nothing better than making that weekly trip to rent movies and leaving with a stack of VHS tapes that would fill your weekend. Oh yeah, and you also had to remember to rewind the movies before you return them to the store. Rediscover your past by digitizing your family's memories with Legacy Box. Watch until the end of this video to find out more about preserving your legacy, and then visit legacybox.com/recollection. Within the last few years, the need for fidget toys has become almost a necessity for kids, as if sitting still for a bit is torture. Kids today have to constantly be fiddling, spinning, or clicking buttons in order to survive the day. The closest thing we had to a fidget spinner was the Rubik's Cube. This puzzle game had you twisting blocks in order to complete each side's color. It required thought and strategy to even come close, but there was also a book you could buy which helped you learn how to solve the puzzle. Aside from the Rubik's Cube, there were also these helicopter seeds that would fall from the trees. I guess picking them up, tossing them in the air, and watching them twirl back down to earth over and over again could be considered fidgeting back in the day. Whenever a disaster strikes today, you seem to always see a GoFundMe page or some other crowdfunding app that is meant to ease the financial burden. But in the 1980s, music was how we raised money for the needy. Songs like Do They Know It's Christmas and We Are the World gathered the decade's biggest stars to perform a charity single that raised money to combat the famine happening in Ethiopia. On top of that, there were also opportunities through television commercials to sponsor children in impoverished countries. For just $11 a month, you believed you were making a difference in the world. The fantasy genre in the 1980s was drastically different than what we see today. With CGI and advances in special effects, franchises like Harry Potter, Avatar, and Game of Thrones look unbelievably real. Maybe that's why cosplay is so popular even for adults. But in the 1980s, you never saw anyone walking around as their favorite character from The Dark Crystal or The Never-Ending Story. These movies used puppets and animatronics that were pretty crude, so you never truly felt immersed in that world. There was Star Wars, which was the most convincing, but it's really nothing like the newer Star Wars films developed today. Instead, we had David Bowie, basically dressed as a 1970s version of himself in the 1986 movie Labyrinth. The 1980s was a revolution in video games being brought to the masses. This is the decade when kids moved away from heading to the arcade and chose to stay home and play their very own Atari, Commodore 64, or Nintendo Entertainment System. It was exhilarating when you opened up that birthday or Christmas present and saw a Nintendo logo, and kids today may never know that feeling. However, video games were large cartridges, and they occasionally needed special treatment before they could be played. Nintendo games like Duck Hunt and The Legend of Zelda may have needed the dust blown out before you could get it to load. If that didn't work, you might also have to try inserting the cartridge in different ways to get it to start. Today, games live online, and video game consoles are just computers that connect to the internet, and they give you instant access to any game you want to play. Oh yeah, and the controllers are wireless now, so you don't have to sit within 6 feet of the television to play a game. During the 1980s, rainbows were not a statement about your sexuality. It was just a colorful way to accessorize an outfit. Who didn't wear the standard 1980s flip-flops with rainbow straps? There were also the occasional set of suspenders or a belt that added a pop of color to any toddler outfit. We also had Punky Brewster, Rainbow Bright, and even Reading Rainbow, which pretty much every kid in the 1980s grew up watching. Today, the world of music is large, and kids have endless options when it comes to finding their favorite musician, from rap to country, Disney Channel pop stars to YouTubers. But in the 1980s, there were really just two megastars in the world of music, Michael Jackson and Madonna. For Michael Jackson, it was his Thriller album from 1982, which became the best-selling album of all time. For Madonna, it was her Like a Virgin album in 1984, which had just enough bad girl edge to it that teenagers went crazy for it. Both artists built careers off the success they had in the 1980s, and they remain icons to this day. The fast food experience in the 1980s was all about the promotions. I mean, who didn't have a set of Smurf glasses in their kitchen cupboard? Not only was the food affordable back then, but you got a ton of free stuff too. From 3D glasses and toys to California raisins and Muppet Babies, McDonald's, Burger King, and Hardee's were always offering up the coolest promo to get you in the door. Even Pizza Hut had promotional drinkware with the release of E.T. in 1982. And who could forget the Noid figures you could pick up at Domino's in the 1980s? Today, the influence that movies and pop culture have on fast food choices is pretty non-existent. And on top of that, inflation is about the only thing on the menu these days. Just like with movies and video games, streaming services give viewers control when it comes to watching their favorite show. But during the 80s, TV shows were a weekly event that aired on a specific channel at a specific time. So if you missed it, you were out of luck. That's why it was so important to consult the TV guide or the listings available in the newspaper if you wanted to watch something. Most people had a favorite night for watching TV, and that led to networks blocking their most popular shows into one night. NBC's must-see TV, although it wouldn't be called that until the 1990s, was Thursday nights, anchored by The Cosby Show, and TGIF became ABC's Big Friday Night, with shows like Full House and Perfect Strangers. If you didn't have a VCR set to record your favorite shows, then you were at the mercy of catching reruns, which might mean months of waiting. Making phone calls, just like writing letters, was how we communicated with people during the 1980s. This was before texting, FaceTime, and smartphones. There were 3 types of calls you could make. A local call, which you would make to friends. A long-distance expensive call, which you waited until after 7 p.m. to make because it was cheaper. And then the collect call, when you wanted the other party to pay for it. The collect call meant dialing the operator first to provide the phone number and your name. They would then call the other person and see if they would accept the charges before they would connect the call. Phone bills were a big part of the 1980s, and it was easy to rack up a huge bill if you weren't careful. Today, we don't even think about phone charges, except when we are adding new lines to our family plan. One of the overarching themes of the 1980s was saying no to drugs. The Just Say No campaign was spearheaded by First Lady Nancy Reagan and was promoted through public events, public service announcements, and even incorporated into TV programming like Different Strokes and Punky Brewster. There was also the DARE program, which had popular shirts that read DARE to keep kids off drugs. These programs targeted street drugs in the 1980s, but if they were relaunched today, they would most certainly be aimed at prescription drugs and the pharmaceutical companies that run non-stop ads on just about every platform. Let me know in the comments if I missed anything, and make sure to sign up for the Recollection Road newsletter using the link in the description. Recollection Road and Legacy Box both believe it's important to preserve the past. If you're like me, there's a box of your family's treasured home movies and photos tucked away somewhere, and Legacy Box can help you preserve them digitally. The process is a simple and safe solution for converting your home movies and photos to thumb drive or to the cloud. Just send in your Legacy Box filled with old VHS and camcorder tapes, film reels, and pictures, and get back digital copies that can be easily enjoyed, shared, and kept organized. It's that easy. Legacy Box is trusted by over 1 million people, and it's all done right here in the USA. Get started preserving your past today. Go to legacybox.com/recollection to get an incredible 55% off. Buy today to take advantage of this exclusive offer and send in your memories when you're ready. Go to legacybox.com/recollection to save 55% while supplies last. If you enjoyed this video, consider watching the other videos in this series. While you're at it, hit subscribe and share Recollection Road with someone you know. As always, thank you so much for watching.